Usually when I make a video like this, it means something actually upset me, so you may hear me get a little bit heated as I go through this particular video and go through this particular article. This is not going to be the only video that I make on this topic, since I do like this particular subgenre and I've had multiple experiences with it, but I just wanted to give a general rundown of some of the things that have been talked about over the past couple of days. So let's go ahead and begin. Hi everyone, my name is Rose, also known as TA Summers. Welcome back to my channel. So today's video is one that is a little bit unexpected. I'm filming this on Friday, so hopefully this should go up the same day that I'm recording it. But what this video is going to be is a discussion on the subgenre of cozy horror. And this has been a topic on Twitter and social media that has taken off like wildfire for some reason. And my first thought was, why is cozy horror like just coming up in my timeline multiple times? Even though I love cozy horror, that's something that I've known about like in the gaming community, as well as even in just in terms of general recommendations even in the bookish community, because while it is not a formalized subgenre, as far as I can tell in terms of formal definitions and things like that, it's been kind of an intra-community thing that has been thrown around and asked about in both, usually like within the gaming community, but also with respect to being in like, like around the library and hearing other patrons like myself like ask for things. Can you recommend anything in terms of cozy fantasy and things like that? So I take this video with an eye both to the writing aspects of it as well as the consumer aspects of it in multiple mediums, so that will kind of give you context of where this video is going to go alongside the particular article, which is the subject for this video. So what I'm going to do is kind of break this down into different parts of discussion just to give you food for thought. I'm not trying to make this into something that I call out anybody specifically on, well, maybe except for the misguided article that I am going to point out for this particular video. But what I'll do is I'll talk about the horror genre, I'll talk about cozy horror and specific examples of it within this measure. And then I will get into the nitty gritty of it, of why this particular article and some of the discussions about it have aptly kind of made me feel uncomfortable and kind of go on the side of keeping a little bit, just a little bit to be uncomfortable, but we'll get into it in full for this video. So without further ado, let's go ahead and begin. So the first thing that I'm going to do with respect to this video is kind of give an overview arguments that I've seen on social media within the past several days. I'm not going to do too many screenshots or do things that are going to like call people out on things, because this is a discussion. This is not like a thing for me to dump on people or for having opinions, because opinions are wide when it comes to the definition and the consumption of horror. So what I'd like to do is kind of give a general overview of what horror is defined as, what cozy horror is meant to be in terms of the consumption of it in different mediums, and then get into the specific issues of this article as it is being defined, and then also kind of getting into some of the discussions and debates on social media about it, particularly on Twitter, since it's been kind of like the subject of discussion for the past several days. So the first thing that I want to do is kind of give you the general definition of horror, taken from sections of I believe this is the Horror Writers Association, and it is from their page, which is What is Horror Fiction, which I will link in the description below for your perusal. If you want to read the whole article, I'm just going to take certain sections of it and read off of that as I'm going through this video. So the first thing is, let's define horror fiction in terms of what it is intended to do and kind of give an overview on that. So according to the Horror Writers Association, what is horror fiction? That is a difficult question. In recent years, the very term has become misleading. If you tell people you write horror fiction, that image that immediately pops into mind is one of Freddy Krueger or maybe Michael Myers, while you were hoping for Shelley's Frankenstein or Stevenson's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. The popularity of the modern horror film, with its endless scenes of blood and gore, has eclipsed the reality of horror fiction. When you add that to a comprehension of how horror evolved as both a marketing category and a publishing niche during the late 80s, horror's first boom time, it's easy to understand why answering the question of what today's horror fiction actually has become so difficult. But let's give it a try, shall we? Webster's Collegiate Dictionary gives the primary definition of horror as a painful and intense fear, dread, or dismay. It stands to reason that horror fiction is fiction that elicits those emotions in the reader. So I definitely want to highlight that specifically as something to come back to when we're discussing this. If we accept this definition, then horror can deal with the mundane or the supernatural, with the fantastic or the normal. It doesn't have to be full of ghosts, ghouls, and things that go bump in the night. The only true requirement is that it'll elicit an emotional reaction that includes some aspect of fear or dread. What makes horror literature so pervasive is that its need to evoke the necessary atmosphere and sense of emotional dread is utterly dependent on who we are as readers, as people. As children, we might be afraid of the shadows looming from a half-closed closet door or the monster we believe lies under the bed. Terrors of the imagination run wild at that age. As adults, our fears become more sophisticated, more grounded in worldly events. They become the death of a loved one, the terminal illness of a small child, the fear of our lives running out of our control. Horror by nature is a personal touch, an intrusion into our comfort levels. It speaks of the human condition and forcibly reminds us of how little we actually know and understand. Robert McCammon, one of the founders of Horror Writers Association, said, "Horror fiction upsets apple carts, burns old buildings, and stampedes the horses. It questions and yearns for answers, and it takes nothing for granted. It is not safe, and it probably rots your teeth too." Horror fiction can be a guide through a nightmare world, entered freely and by the reader's own will. And since horror can be many, many things and go in many, many directions, that gilded nightmare can shock, educate, illuminate, threaten, shriek, and whisper before it lets the readers loose. This is from Twilight Zone magazine in October of 1986. Years later, Winter would echo these statements in the afterword to his award-winning anthology Revelations. Horror is that which cannot be made safe, evolving, ever-changing, because it is about our relentless need to confront the unknown, the unknowable, and the emotion we experience when in its thrall. Something else that I want to point out here, it says, horror once again has once again become primarily about emotion. It is once again writing that delves deep inside and forces us to confront who we are, to examine what we are afraid of, and to wonder what lies ahead down the road of life. Authors once considered fringe voices are now brought up in the pages of newspaper, and awards, and even the plot lines of cult series. Many editors think of this as a new golden age for the genre. If the market experiences another period of oversaturation, horror may suffer another slump, but it will undoubtedly return. Just as our fears and terrors change with time, so too will the definition of horror, and not just from age to age, but from person to person, precisely as it should. That last bit was actually a pretty potent one, which is kind of the point where I will lead into what cozy horror has become in terms of things. So with respect to cozy horror, my particular experience of it has been one that I've heard in gaming circles since at least about 2019. But I've seen articles online and even Reddit posts and things like that have even gone before then, like even 2014 and 2015. So people have been asking about cozy horror or recommendations as in the reading vernacular or the consumer vernacular of what cozy horror examples are out there, and asking for more of that particular subgenre. But there are a lot of people who don't really know what cozy horror entails, especially if you are not a direct member of those inter-communities and things like that. So I'm going to try to give a base definition of it as best I can, because part of the challenge of cozy horror is, number one, it seems like it's a contradiction in and of itself. You have the term cozy, which many people say that it's synonymous with comfort, which that's not always the case, and I'll explain a little bit more about that in a little bit. But they look at the term cozy paired with horror and think it's a contradiction within itself and that it can't exist. Whereas if you think about it in the way that I'm going to explain it in this, it may make a little bit more sense. So with respect to cozy horror, usually what people mean by it is that it's this type of horror where you don't have as much of the gore or jump scares that like are usually synonymous with respect to when people think of horror. What it entails is usually an experience that allows you to get into a world where you're following the characters, where you're following a specific image or thing, where it takes you into, it allows you to experience this realm where you're looking through the character's eyes and you're experiencing things through their things that they are afraid of, things that bother them, things that challenge their world purview in terms of like embracing the amount of fear and whimsical and things that can terrify them, scare them, or thrill them, but it's in a way that is immersive and yet allows you to explore these things in a way that makes it both a turn off as well as desirable. So that's basically like the best that I can sum up with, even though it's a lot more complicated than that. To give an example of cozy horror, I actually talked about this in my Twitter thread online. I specifically cited some examples of media, which like another aspect of cozy horror that I think that people struggle with is that it's not just one isolated genre. It's not a genre within itself. It's one label that can encompass many different subgenres of horror. So it's not defined by one particular monster or one particular aspect. It can incorporate elements of the psychological. It can incorporate elements of paranormal. It can incorporate elements of humor and satire, but what it does is an awareness of horror where you as the consumer or reader are experiencing through the eyes of the character that you're following, and you're allowed to explore that world in a way that promotes a sense of wonder and engagement, and willful engagement, mind you, in terms of things, but there are also elements that scare, thrill, terrify you, and engage you in terms of the eyes of that character. And it can be things where it can be fascinating to be able to explore that, but at the same time a turn off when you meet certain things that the character experiences that also turn you off, and not necessarily in the spectrum of seeing on-page gore or on-page scares and things like that, but that sense of foreboding, that sense of terror, or things like that that affect the character directly. So that's the best way that I can explain that in terms of what cozy horror is. Examples of this are actually easier to give when it comes to gaming, because as a gamer, like in terms of things, as opposed to picking up a novel, you have experiences where you can explore the world of a particular game that you're playing in terms of things that the character interacts with that are new to them. So for example, if you are playing American McGee's Alice Madness Returns, you're allowed to interact with the whimsical world and the artwork and just the beauty of the world that Alice goes into, even though there are things that she has to confront that are terrifying and even unsettling, like for the player to be able to interact with. So that's one example. Another example is the indie game Limbo, which follows a boy who is in this dark, terrifying world, and he has to navigate in this kind of monochromatic universe these different terrors and things through solving puzzles and things like that, in terms of being able to try to survive it and get and emerge from the world. And like, it tells a story within a story in terms of you following that character throughout the game from start to finish. So the reason why that would be called cozy horror is because not only are you experiencing the story, which is terrifying, and you have a number of times when you face obstacles and things that will kill you in a matter of moments, and it has that tension and foreboding and things like that. But what it allows you to do is also an intuitive element to it as well. You're solving puzzles, you're engaging with the environment. You're not exactly sure what to expect, but and it compels you to move forward in that respective environment. So when we talk about cozy horror, specifically within the gaming community, that's kind of the element that I'm focusing on linking with that definition in terms of things. So I hope that clarifies it a little bit more in terms of what cozy horror is, at least in the gaming community. Now, when it comes to cozy horror in other media, it's a little bit harder because I think people mislabel it and misattribute to it like for other things, and we'll get into that after we get into the Mary Sue article. But when it comes to specific media, when it comes to movies, when it comes to TV shows, when it comes to things like that in visual media, or even picking up books, there's a lot more linearity because you don't have that choose your own adventure. You don't have that same kind of flexibility of interaction when it comes to cozy horror, because the cozy horror aspect leans into being able to have that sense of discovery, and you have a little bit more leeway in playing the games versus the linear stories that are told in film or television or in bookish media. So I want to point out that there's a clear distinction in that in terms of thing. It's not that cozy horror can't exist in print, in books, across different mediums, but there's a certain element and a certain difference that is distinguishable when it comes to talking about the gaming experience of cozy horror versus print or visual media when it comes to horror that doesn't have that interactive component. The challenge in trying to define cozy horror is a bit difficult also because there is no formalized definition for cozy horror as of the present day in terms of things. People have had different takes on it in terms of talking about specific forms of media for recommendations to people and things like that. But it tends to cross with over different, have intersections with other subgenres within horror. There's not a formal definition for it, and it can actually apply to multiple different genres within horror, and that also includes dark fantasy as well. And distinctly speaking, it's not that dark cozy horror can't exist. It's the fact that, and I would say it's more than just vibes. Like a lot of people I've heard like in the community like talk about cozy horror being vibes only. That's not necessarily true either, because there are certain aspects of the storytelling medium where you have the intention from the author or the creator to create a sense of coziness, a sense of familiarity, a sense of evocation of emotion from the reader or the consumer of that particular media, to identify with elements that that draw them into that narrative, that draw them into where it is desirable, but at the same time you feel the sense of foreboding, the sense of danger, the sense of peril, the sense of trying to figure out where the threat is coming from. And I would say that usually that when people refer to cozy horror when it comes to written literature, it has mostly to do with low stakes horror. There are different stakes of horror, and I really want to emphasize this. There are different levels to horror as many people know, like in terms of being able to pick up a book or a piece of media to be able to consume horror, does not exist on one specific plane. It has varying genres, subgenres within it, and it has varying degrees of presentation. So, like we would say in the romance community, for example, when you have a relationship that takes place on screen or within a book or what have you, you can have situations where couples are portrayed in ways that are no heat, where there's really like a minimal sense of any kind of intimacy. It's that feeling of love and being in love. There can be low heat, there can be mid heat, there can be high heat, piping hot heat, like in terms of how you see the development of a romance, and also different degrees of relationships in that vein for things. So that's one thing to consider. So when we're talking about horror, there are different degrees of horror and intensity. So you can have low intensity horror, you can have mid intensity horror, you can have all the gore, all the blood, all the violence, all these turn off things in terms of things. So I think it's important to recognize that there are different levels in which in the horror community we can consume horror in that vein. So when you talk about cozy horror, at least in terms of hypothetically speaking, whether it exists or not, it absolutely can exist if you're talking about a lower intensity of stakes, a lower intensity of um, different elements when juxtaposed to other things, and also the cross genre component of it. There are many things that are very personal that can be consumed in the sense of cozy horror, and it's usually specific to the narrative and intentionally does so in terms of giving you that sense of comfort, in terms of inviting you into that story and wanting to explore certain elements of it while being thrilled, chilled, scared, disturbed, things like that. So I will leave it at that in terms of the definition of cozy horror as best as I can explain it. And then we will get into the point of why this Mary Sue article really got under my skin. So let's continue this discussion. So several days back on June 6th of 2023, Julia Glassman for the Mary Sue actually wrote an article about the subgenre of cozy horror, and evidently got a lot of pushback for it. So I'm gonna kind of go through this particular article to kind of like clue you in terms of things that I noticed about it and what led to the making of this video. Instead of arguing about this horror genre, why not curl up and enjoy it? So that I even have issues with the article title of this because it's so judgy. But let's get into it in terms of what Glassman says in this. So we start off with, I'm a relative newbie to the world of horror. That right there is a very bold claim for someone who says, why not curl up and enjoy it? Because it assumes that this person knows the genre that she's describing. So I did pause for one moment reading that first line and thinking, okay, that may not bode well for this article, but let me continue. Sure, I've read and watched the classics, but it's only recently that I've come to appreciate the complexity and variety of what horror has to offer. Horror doesn't have to be limited to jump scares and gore. True. You can love horror even if you're not into slashers. Also true. Finally realizing this fact was a revelation for me. It was aided by modern horror pieces by like Midsommar and The Witch. Midsommar and The Witch are not cozy horror. I just want to point that out right now. But well, like I'll leave that where it is. She may have just been in terms of talking about general examples of horror that she was getting into. So I'll give leverage to that. But Midsommar, definitely not cozy horror. if you know anything about it, but I won't speak too much on that in this particular video. I'll just continue. Which lean hard into atmosphere, but don't make you piss yourself in extent terror. Not exactly true. Which what's especially great about horror is all the subgenres in which it can be categorized. True. Paranormal horror, slasher flicks, body horror, folk horror, psychological horror. Psychological horror is one of my favorites, so I'll leave that where it is. Ghost stories, also one of my favorites. Gothic romances, also one of my favorites. Monster movies. The best horror has as many facets as a gemstone, with one we're easily fitting into multiple genres. That is also true. My personal favorite is folk horror, the eldritch monsters, human or otherwise, that arise from folklore and pre-industrial societies. Think of abominations, embroidered aprons, or unspeakable rituals that make the crops grow. I can't get enough of it. Imagine my excitement then when I found out about horror genre I've never heard of, but instantly made sense. Cozy horror. Okay, what is cozy horror? Okay, so we're getting into how she defines it, so let's see how this is. If, like me, you love one, ghosties, two, beasties, and three, Stephen loves of Coco, then cozy horror will be right up your alley. Okay, I definitely don't think that's encompassing of cozy horror at all. I think that just gets it wrong because that's not the universal experience of cozy horror. Like in terms of things, there are elements of cozy horror that can make it cozy, but not quite like that. But let me continue. The term is a few years old. It's actually older than that, but let me continue. But it most recently bubbled up in on the May 30th, 2023 episode of the Horror Podcast Books in the Freezer. I haven't heard of that one. That might be something that I look into. The episode defines cozy horror thusly. When you have horror, you have all the spooky elements, but if you know, for example, you're going to have that happy ending or low stakes, I'm glad she said that, or even if the stakes are big, it's surrounded by humor or love interest or the things that kind of negate those big stakes. No, I'm gonna push back on that because the stakes are still there for cozy horror in terms of things. There's a sense of foreboding. There's a sense of danger, peril, things like that. It never really goes away, but it's different elements that the character that you're following, the viewpoint character, or things like that, have to endure in order to get to a specific point or end goal. So I would push back on that definition in terms of things. I haven't listened to that particular podcast, but that isn't completely true. Cozy horror may sound safer than other horror genres, but it's a mistake to think that it's any less complex or sophisticated. Cozy horror can still have complicated characters, yes. Lush cinematography or prose, yes. Or plot twists that make you gasp, absolutely yes. It can still have uncanny elements that stick with you after slowly creeping under your skin. Yes, yes and no, because the thing about it is there are elements of cozy horror where it can still scare, thrill you, and chill you depending on what the character goes through. But there's this sense of enticing you to follow that character's journey or be immersed in the world where it's terrifying, horrifying, things like that. Things that engage you in addition to the element of fear that you feel when you're experiencing that story. So I want to make that abundantly clear in contrast to what this is saying. What are some examples of cozy horror? If you turn to the horror aficionados of the internet, you might hear answers like Over the Garden Wall. I have not seen Over the Garden Wall, but I'll have to put a note on that. But I think that is specifically for children. The horror novels of Teen Kingfisher, I especially recommend What Moves the Dead, a retelling of the fall of the House Usher that's equal parts cozy and chilly. I have that on my reading list, but I have not read it yet. Or the work of Tim Burton. Tim Burton, you could argue that with respect to The Nightmare Before Christmas, but again, part of that, you have to kind of like understand, like kind of take into consideration who of those movies and the audience that particular media is intended for. So if you're thinking of Tim Burton's The Nightmare Before Christmas, that is specifically a children's movie, and the scares and the thrills and the chills and things like that would be chilling for children. It's not saying that adults can't consume it and things like that, but I would not designate Tim Burton's Nightmare Before Christmas as an example of cozy horror in the adult vernacular. It would be for children in terms of things where the upscares are not as intense as some other movies like. I would say that it has still those elements of terror and horror that, which also paired with the paranormal and things like that, that it could be considered cozy horror. So I want to point out, try to think of it in the sense of being cozy horror intended for kids rather than as a cozy thing for adults, just to keep that in mind. Some people even suggest The Shining. I would say no. And Spirited Away count as cozy horror. And while I would argue The Shining isn't cozy, yes, and Spirited Away isn't horror, also yes, I'm just glad people are into both of those movies because they're great. After the podcast aired, Sadie Hartman, author of the forthcoming 101 horror books to read before you're murdered, brought the conversation to Twitter. So it shows a picture of Sadie Hartman's tweet, which I'll put on the screen for you here for your reference. It says, this episode of Books Freezer Pod is so good. Agatha from She Wore Black Pod talks about cozy horror books and movies with Stephanie, and now I need to read Mooncakes and ask my husband for the skulls of my enemies so I can plant succulents in them. So some of the books that are cited are Darcy Coates' The Whispering Dead, Sally Thorne's Angela Frankenstein Makes Her Match, Welcome to Night Vale, Cackle by Rachel Harrison, R.L. Stein, Return to Fear Street, Suburban Hell by Maureen Kilmer, and several other examples. So some of these I have heard of, other of these I have not read, so I can't speak to them, but I definitely am interested in looking into these titles as recommendations to be able to pick them up in terms of things and give you my thoughts on them. But they may very well be cozy horror. It's just a matter of seeing. So let's see. Hartman and others also gave examples of their favorite cozy horror. Someone also mentioned Over the Garden Wall Again. Some mentioned the TV series What We Do in the Shadows, which I have not seen, but I definitely want to. And so there are others that are mentioned here, but I'll keep going with the article. And so it continues with saying, of course, you know what happens on Twitter. People are compelled to take something fun and wholesome and turn into a heated debate. Okay, so I'm going to stop right here and kind of talk about what the author of this particular article completely ignored in terms of things, because there was a very heated debate going on Twitter about some things that were being mentioned as cozy horror that were not cozy horror, and some of them that were fixated on works where there was a component of anti-blackness and even racism and grappling with certain things, and also mislabeling certain movies and pieces of media as cozy horror when they were not cozy horror. For example, Midsommar is one that was mentioned as cozy horror, like in terms of people mentioning examples when that particular work is not cozy horror. If you know anything about it in terms of the themes that it has, the level of horror that it details, and that sort of thing, that is not considered cozy. Another example, which was spoken within the film measure of things, was Evil Dead, as well as Texas Chainsaw Massacre. I would not consider Texas Chainsaw Massacre or Evil Dead as cozy horror at all, because the thing about it is they may be comforting for the people who consume them because they are familiar with the medium and the story that they're trying to tell, but the execution of those particular movies, as well as the intent behind them, are not meant to be in the vernacular of where you can experience them and aside from the graphicness of that particular brand of horror. For some people, it because that familiarity and engagement with those particular films can be comforting to them individually. It does not necessarily mean that the intention behind the way that that story is told or the way that it's showcased is considered cozy horror. So I want to make that very, very clear. Another one that was specifically mentioned in terms of the book experience was the mention of Mexican Gothic by Silvia Moreno Garcia. And if you have read Silvia Moreno Garcia's work in terms of Mexican Gothic, that is not a cozy horror to be had, because the thing about it is the immersion into that world and the execution of the themes specifically with respect to that book. And I still need to do a formal review of that book on this channel. I won't go into any spoilers or anything for the sake of this particular video, but if you haven't engaged with that novel and read it from cover to cover in terms of what it chooses to do and why, it is not cozy. It is not cozy at all. There were several people who were giving examples of things as cozy horror specifically that were not examples of cozy horror, and it upset a number of different people in terms of things, because it's like, then why are these pieces of media being labeled as cozy when they're not, when they deal with very traumatizing themes and things that are more intense and not low stakes at all. So I want to be clear that this article missed the mark on a lot of discussions that were going on Twitter, that was the reason why I wanted to make this video, because it's very infuriating that the article writer missed all of those nuanced conversations in the writing of this article, including misnaming certain aspects of things. So I want to be clear. I think the author's non-familiarity with the genre may have played into this, because she can't speak to the engagement and to some of the experiences of what some of these mediums talk about in terms of theme, in terms of character, in terms of things where they're really not cozy and they're specifically tackling certain themes when it comes to race relations, when it comes to fears that are like more complex themes that are actually not cozy and are unsettling, and explore that vernacular where it's very different from the intention and the experience of cozy horror. So I want to make that clear. So continuing on, it's very the article gets really judgmental from here, and I know that I'm kind of heated, like even just reading some of the things from here. But sure enough, people got upset about the existence of cozy horror. Some claim that cozy horror is an oxymoron. Others sniff that anything cozy must be infantilizing. Others claim that coziness is gentrifying horror, or that cozy horror robs horror of its essence, and none of that is true. But what's odd about the whole debate is that the time people spent denouncing a genre is time they could spend reading or watching stuff they actually like. Why on earth do people care so much? Yeah, it's really judgmental, and I don't like where it goes from here. So she tries to answer the question that she poses, why do people hate cozy horror? The heart of the problem, it seems to me, is that many people see horror as an endurance contest. The more viscerally terrifying something is, the reasoning goes, the better it is at being horror. There is a convention in horror circles that certain types of horror are being elevated over certain other types, which I do think is a valid point to make in terms of the minds of people, because horror can be a lot of different things, and it can have different intersections between the cross genres and things like that. And cozy horror itself is not just one subgenre. It can encompass a lot of genres depending on what the aim of it is in terms of the vernacular of the story. But The Ring, according to this logic, is better than What We Do in the Shadows. I don't know why she says that, because it is scarier. Terror is the only metric by which horror is judged, and the more terrified a viewer or reader can stand to be, the better the horror fan they are. If you cover your eyes, you failed at loving horror. It's also undeniable that this problem is gendered. Oh, and this was the point where I was like, okay, we need to have a discussion on how wrong this is. It's also undeniable that this problem is gendered. Endurance is associated with masculinity, and coziness is associated with femininity. As a cisgender woman who is also Black and Native, who has been consuming media and horror for almost most of my life, I feel a sense of upset at the limiting factors of this particular thing, because it erases so many different people who are fans of different types of horrors and different horror subgenres and things like that. It misses the mark so much on making that blanket statement. And I'm glad that people were calling it out for that, because it was like, why would you even make a statement like that and erase so many different people who anybody of any intersection can enjoy horror for what it is, whether it's cozy or whether it's intense or somewhere in the wide between of that. So I want to emphasize how wrong this. It's so infuriating. Maybe that supposed femininity is what makes cozy horror feel so threatening to people who consider themselves hardcore horror fans. The cozy horror debate is almost identical to YA debate. Oh Lord. Yeah, that's missing the mark too, but let me continue. Instead of recognizing that genres are fluid and multifaceted, people run screaming from anything associated with teen girls. Okay, how? That's like the problem with that I have in terms of things is that young adult is an age group. It is not a genre. Is a young adult is filled with multiple genres that are intended for multiple audiences. So it's not just teen girls. You were talking about teen boys. You were talking about teen non-binary people. You're talking about teenagers of many different identities in terms of and intersections of identity. It's not cool to limit that particular stigma with cozy horror. It's not the same thing. So let me continue. After the debate erupted, Hartman posted a link to Brian J. Showers' That Didn't Scare Me Thoughts on Horror Fiction, an essay that gets to the heart of why horror can be so much more than just scary. Okay, and that's something that I probably need to pick up myself just to be able to see. There are plenty of emotional sensations available to the skilled writer, Showers writes. The adrenaline rush of fear being only one of them, and this sensation alone is insufficient to judge the vast scope of horror. So much for that didn't scare me. If the idea of cozy horror offends you, there's a simple solution. Don't read or watch it. I don't like the way that that's told either. And if you find out that something you love has been classified as cozy horror, then perhaps think twice before you decide you're living in a horror movie yourself. This article is so frustrating on so many levels because it comes from a place of judgment and misguidedness in terms of things when you're talking about a subgenre that has many nuances and many different degrees of representation. So where do you even begin? I think for the general summation of things, really the only thing that Julia Glassman got right in the Mary Sue article is the fact that horror is multi-genred and has multiple levels of things where they intersect and interconnect. It is not just one aspect to focus on. So if we're talking about cozy horror specifically, she didn't really name any concrete examples of cozy horror, even cozy horror to the point where it's within different mediums. In the gaming community, I can tell you cozy horror gets talked about quite a bit. There are articles that mention inside, that mention Omori, that mention, as I said before, limbo, little nightmares, things like that. And it is really dependent upon how much you engage with the respect to the story that is being told. Within cozy horror, there is an element that as I mentioned before, that pulls you in when you're following the character perspective, and it's once it draws you to be more to be fascinated, to be a part of that world, to look at the daily different iterations of things that that character does within that world, to see its nuances, to see its things. But there are also things about it where you're faced with the unexpected, you're faced with things about it that are undesirable, that introduce peril, scares, things that unsettle you in terms of things, and that is the horror aspect of it, even though there are elements of it that are cozy. So I think there's a general misunderstanding from this particular article of what cozy horror is, where it originated, where it has been and where it's gone throughout different mediums. And it did not escape my notice that she mentioned nothing about gaming. And if you even do a cursory search on cozy horror, you can see where threads are talking about not only book recommendations and things like that, but also game recommendations and things like that. So it's clear to me that the author could have done much more research out of the term of judgment and anger, because I can understand it from a visceral level in terms of things I'm saying, like if you like lower stakes horror, if you like things that are a little bit more outside of the vein of that gory jump scare, like thrilling like aspects where like the horror is put in your face continuously all the time, every time, like, you know, in terms of the vein of some of the more popular horror writers like Stephen King or Dean Koontz or figures like that, you're not getting the whole spectrum of what horror is and what it can be. And so I at least understand that she's trying to approach it from, say, hey, like, you know, people like different levels of horror. But what she messes up on specifically is failing to really define it, really engage with the media in terms of explaining what the components are that make certain things cozy horror, and really giving more of a definition in terms of solidifying it to say, okay, so this is what makes this particular media cozy horror versus other types of horror and elements to it. So I think this was an article that overall was very underwhelming. So what I want to do is I want to do a follow-up video to this to kind of talk about what cozy horror is versus what it isn't. I wanted to kind of start off the conversation here by reacting to this particular article and why it was so frustrating to read, and seeing some of the Twitter reactions to. I don't want to put anybody on the spot, like in terms of Twitter conversations, because there are some people who I respect who really don't feel that cozy horror exists, which I would disagree with it, but I understand where they were coming from because of the examples that were given that were really not good examples of cozy horror. But I think there's a failure because cozy horror is being conflated with media that is designed to make you comfortable. I think that's it, like a misinterpretation in terms of where people are taking with this, because with respect to cozy horror, the horror elements are still there. They are not erased in any way, like shape or form and stuff like that. You're still being thrilled, you're still being chilled, you're still feeling all the things that you would feel like in a horror thing, and exploring the unknown and exploring things that are terrifying, but you're engaging with that particular world in a way that still compels you to want to interact with it and engage with it, which is the aspect of where it is cozy. And also with respect to the authorial intent, which you can't always tell in terms of things. If the author says that their piece of medium is not cozy, then I would listen to that author and not dismiss in terms of the intent of the particular work that they're doing. But what I would say, there are creators, there, even myself included, I've written cozy horror before, and I would still be willing to write cozy horror stories for anybody like who wants to know more about the genre. But I have an idea of knowing what it is, but explaining it to someone who hasn't really engaged with this particular subgenre, which crosses between multiple subgenres, can be difficult for people who are not already a part of that community. Because the thing about it is, it's like, I know inherently that cozy horror exists, and like I've given a basic definition of it, but there's still more nuanced facets to it that can differ between the stories that you're telling. So it's not just one subgenre which has a specific set of themes or a specific set of ideas that are all common between them, because they are so different. So is cozy does not equal the same thing as comfort when it comes to personal experience of a narrative. You can watch, like I gave the example on Twitter of how I have my comfort watches with respect to the Murderbot Diaries by Martha Wells, as well as the TV series Twin Peaks as a comfort watch. But none of those would be pieces of media that I would say are cozy in terms of the way that they're constructed. The reason why I'm comforted with them is because I've had multiple experiences and draws in terms of being able to engage with those particular works. So I've developed a sense of comfort around them in terms of my familiarity with them, in terms of the way that I'm drawn to loving the type of stories that it tell, in terms of following the characters, in terms of learning about the characters and things like that. But none of that means that the environment that is specifically evoked in those particular works are cozy. So I want to make sure that people know the difference between having something in media that is cozy in the construction of a story versus having a level of comfort in engaging with that story because of the familiarity of it. So when someone says something like, they say, oh, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, that's a comfort watch for me. It makes sense to say comfort because of it being a staple of its particular subgenre of horror, and also because of it's assuming multiple that the person who has watched it has engaged with it multiple times for their personal own space. It does not mean that the story construction is told in a way that is cozy. So I want to make sure that people know the difference between cozy and comfort, and that they are two separate things when it comes to engagement with the media, as well as the reception of media and the construction of the media. So, and that can be true between books, between movies, between games, between any kind of media that you pick up, even music. If you listen to music that evokes a certain feeling of dread or horror or things like that, that tell narratives, that tell stories or things like that. So it's something to consider and know, and it's important to know the distinction between them when we're talking about cozy horror as being a subgenre of horror, which encompasses a lot of different elements and can cross different other subgenres, as opposed to being something that is self-contained in its own thing. The other thing that I want to point out is not to conflate cozy horror with horror that is intended for a specific audience. So a lot of the examples that were given for cozy horror were actually intended for children's media. So I don't know much about Over the Garden Wall to be able to reflect on it, but I do know that Goosebumps, the book series by R.L. Stine, was mentioned several times as cozy horror, and that is actually wrong, and I'll explain why. Goosebumps as a collective series is intended for children. It is it encompasses themes that are horrifying and directed towards children. So with the intent of it, it's meant to speak to a children's audience. So I remember reading distinctly, piano lessons can be murder, as well as Night of the Living Dummy, and being terrified by those as children. So it had the intended effect of being terrifying and scary. None of those experiences for children specifically would be considered cozy. It may be for an adult who can recognize the nuances and who can recognize certain things of it, where the stakes of it may be perceived as low to that particular age group. But when it comes to a child, when it comes to their fears, when it comes to their experiences, it's going to be a completely different perspective. So I want to point out specifically, just because you label a children's piece of media that is intended for children as horror, you can't label it as cozy horror if it's intended to speak to the level of horror for a child or a teenager. If you're speaking like, say, for example, the Fear Street series, which is also by R.L. Stine, and it speaks to a teen audience. So I want to stress that if you have things, now it may be different if you have a book or a piece of media that is meant to encompass all ages, in terms of things where it evokes a sense of fear in you based on certain situations that the character goes through, but yet you're in on it, and it speaks to the audience itself in terms of saying, hey, we're letting you into this. It's going to be thrilling, chilling, and scary, but you have an insight to the story elements as a consumer, as a general consumer, whether it to where it speaks to every age, that it's thrilling and scary and creepy in certain things, but you still recognize it as not that as something that you can either laugh at or you can engage with in terms of things. Where in that perspective, if the intention of the narrative is to be thrilling but also draw you into it in a way that makes you engage and want to be in that world, then it can be cozy based on the intention of the media itself and how it's presented. So I want to point that out specifically in terms of things. And people have asked me to name examples. I did name examples with respect to some of the games that I mentioned in terms of things, but it is very hard to define because it depends on the medium that it's being told. And as I said before, when it comes to cozy horror in terms of gaming, there's a different level of engagement versus versus narratives that are a little bit more linear when you experience a book or a movie or a piece of media that where you don't have that level of exploration in terms of seeing things and engaging with things in the world in a way that the gaming experience specifically provides. So it's a different conversation entirely depending on the media that you are engaging with. All right, I think we can wrap it up here, at least as an initial discussion of this particular topic. Though I definitely think that this is not the only video that I'm going to be making with respect to talking about cozy horror. This is just the beginning, and I'm going to try to approach it in a way that is definitely not as judgmental as this article was, and definitely not as limited in terms of the scope that it presents it in. And I thank you for sticking around to engage in this discussion with me. Please feel free to list your own examples. If you know about cozy horror, if you have things that you want to add in terms of specific examples of books that you have picked up, of other media, even games that you have picked up that would be considered cozy horror, and if you want to talk about it, feel free to leave some comments and even other response videos if you want to as well. But thank you for watching. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, hit the subscribe button, and hit the notification bell to be notified of when I post new videos. Thank you again for watching. I hope you have a wonderful day, and I'll see you next video.